Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're doing part 5 of the Summer-Ween DIYs. For this project, I'm going to be using this plastic Jacko Lantern. It's just one of the cheap ones that lights up, but I thought it would be perfect to give a little makeover to. I'm going to start by just removing the little battery case for the light so that doesn't get messed up in the process. Then I'm going to go over this entire Jacko Lantern with 2 coats of some chalk paint in the color plaster. I think the biggest issue with these kinds of Jacko Lanterns or pumpkins is the stem doesn't look too realistic, so I decided to bring out some air dry clay and I'm gonna make a new stem for this pumpkin. I tend to like the very long twisty stems on pumpkins, so I'm just rolling this out and making the top of it thin and long. Once I have the basic shape that I like, I am gonna start gently twisting my clay, and this is gonna make it look more realistic. When I'm happy with the general shape of it, I'm going to take a pair of scissors and make 4 little cuts at the bottom of the stem. Then I'm going to pull those flaps out and kind of squeeze them and press them between my fingers to flatten them. You can use your fingers for the next part, but I just decided to use the scissors and press up into the stem to make a little hole so that I could press the clay stem over top of the existing stem on the jack-o'-lantern. I didn't use any glue to put this stem on here. Once it's dry, it's going to stay on the pumpkin. Then I'm going to use a little bit of water on my fingers and my thumb, and here at the bottom I'm just going to push the clay really hard down onto the pumpkin and drag off the excess. This is going to help blend that clay stem down into the jack-o'-lantern and make it look like it was a part of it all along. Then I'll just use some more of that water and smooth everything out and make sure that I have this a little bit saturated so that I can add some texture to this stem. Then I'll just use a little clay tool. You can use anything really with a sharp edge, and I'm going to make that texture of the stem just by making random lines all over it. Once I'm finished, I'll take a little bit more of that water and just smooth out any extra clay that's hanging on. Then I'll set it aside and let it dry overnight. The next day, I painted the stem with 2 coats of the plaster color chalk paint, and then I used a chippy brush and some of my black wax that I made to go over it. And as I'm going over it, I am dragging the paintbrush down the pumpkin some so that it looks like that stem blends right into it. I kind of wanted to make this jack-o'-lantern match one of the pumpkins that I made that had words stamped on it. But this time I wanted to use some Halloween stamps and then just some of my other stamps that aren't particularly Halloween, but they could be considered spooky or vintage. So I pretty much just pulled out a bunch of my random stamps with some Halloween stamps, and I just started stamping the jack-o'-lantern. I started around his face because this is going to make it easier to just work around his eyes, nose, and his mouth. Then I just continued stamping until he was filled up. Once I was finished, to actually finish this off, I'm going to use some European Gold Rub and Buff, and I am lightly just brushing it over the jack-o'-lantern to add some aging and make this look more vintage and old. For this project, I'm using this wood shelf that I found at the thrift store, but instead of using it as a shelf, I thought this would make a really cute tabletop sign / book rack. The first thing I did was just take all the pieces apart just to make this easier to work with. Then I took the pieces outside and sprayed them with some Easy Off to get rid of that orangey stain on here. I sprayed the pieces really good and then just let them sit outside for about 4 hours before scrubbing it with some warm soapy water. Then I sat all the pieces in the sun to completely dry, and this is what they look like afterwards. For my sign, I decided that I wanted it to kind of look like an old town sign. So I made this little sign in Canva and it says Sleepy Hollow just ahead, pun definitely intended, with a little arrow out to the side. To trace it onto the board, I'm using some carbon paper and I'm just going to tape that carbon paper down so it's not moving around, then tape the sign over top of it. I used the little pressure tool that came with my carbon paper to just trace over all those letters. And if you're a huge fan of Sleepy Hollow, the movie, you may recognize the font that I used for the Sleepy Hollow. It came straight from the movie box. So once I had it traced onto the wood piece, then I used my paint marker, and I'm only going to do the outline with the paint marker. To paint the letters in, I'm just going to use a really tiny brush and some black acrylic paint. And this is just a personal preference. If you prefer to fill in the letters with your paint marker, you could do that, but I like to save the ink in my paint markers and just use some acrylic paint. Once I had everything painted in, then I did seal this with some acrylic sealer and put it back together. I found this ceramic piece at the thrift store. I'm pretty sure it was an old clock, just missing the insert. But the shape reminded me of a tombstone, so that's what I'm going to be turning this into. I'm going to start by giving this a couple coats of some black chalk paint, just letting it dry completely in between the coats. Then I wanted to make this into an Edgar Allan Poe tombstone, so I am going to use this little label mold that I got from Amazon and some air dry clay to make the little label for his name. And to imprint his name onto this label, I'm just using some small alphabet stamps that I got from Dollar Tree, and I will just press those down into the clay to spell out Poe. Since the top of this ceramic piece is rounded, I'm just going to kind of bend and shape that label to fit the rounded top. Then I'll use some gel super glue to attach it and let this dry overnight. The next day, I again just used some black chalk paint and painted over that label. Then I brought out some European gold rub and buff, and I'm gonna start by going over all the details first on here. Then I will use whatever is left over on the brush to do the entire thing. For the little insert part, I wanted to add a photo of Edgar Allan Poe, so I just printed this off on my computer and then cut it down to size to fit. I ended up printing this on cardstock, so I just used a glue stick and then placed it inside the little hole. Then I wanted to make a small frame to go around his portrait and also just hide the edges of the photo. So I'm using this mold and some air dry clay to make a small thin little frame to go around it. I ended up having to stretch it just a little bit to make it fit the entire thing, but then I just used some gel super glue to attach it. I let that air dry clay dry completely and then painted over it very carefully with some black chalk paint. Then once it was dry, to make it match the rest of the little tombstone, I went over it with some rub and buff. For this project, you're gonna need a Barbie doll. This one is just from the Dollar Tree, and I highly recommend this one because you can bend her knees. And we're gonna need Barbie in a sitting position for this. The first thing I'm gonna do is protect Barbie and her beautiful hair from some damage, because this is gonna get just a little bit messy. So I'm wrapping Barbie in a couple layers of plastic cling wrap. Then you'll need either a stack of books or a larger box for this. Really anything higher up that Barbie can sit on with her legs hanging over. Be sure to protect your books or the box that you're using with a little bit of parchment paper. Once everything is set up, then we can turn this into a Grim Reaper sort of ghoul. You'll just need any sort of fabric that you may already have on hand. This is just a piece of Dollar Tree fabric. And it doesn't matter what color it is because we're going to paint it later. So I just kind of draped it around her like a cloak and then cut off a lot of the excess. Then I mixed up some plaster of Paris in an old water jug. Just be sure to use something that you can throw out once you're done. And I have the exact plaster of Paris that I use on my Amazon storefront. Once I had it mixed well, then I dipped my piece of fabric down into the plaster of Paris and just kind of swished it around and made sure that the entire thing was fully saturated. You'll definitely want to use some gloves for this project and also be sure to protect your space. As I was moving this fabric around in the plaster of Paris, I did use my fingers and kind of spread it over the fabric, stretching the fabric out and just making sure that every piece of this was saturated. Then I placed it over the Barbie, lifted her up, and slid it underneath her. Again, I'm just kind of cloaking this fabric around her. Then I just kept shaping it and making sure that the front portion was a little bit open because you're going to need to remove Barbie in just a little bit. I ended up letting this sit for maybe about an hour. You want the plaster to harden just a little bit, but not completely because, like I said, you need to be able to kind of wiggle Barbie out from inside of there. You'll definitely want to keep checking on this as it's drying, and pretty much as soon as it starts to harden, you can remove Barbie from the inside. Then I just set it aside and let it dry for about 24 hours. Now, plaster of Paris has a tendency to be a little bit delicate, but there is a way to make it a lot stronger, and that is by covering it with wood glue. So after the 24 hours, that's exactly what I did with this one. I just used an old brush that I didn't really care about and some wood glue and covered this entire thing. You'll even notice after this wood glue is dry that this actually starts to feel like it's made of wood. And it's basically just a way to seal the plaster of Paris and make it stronger. To finish it off, I'm just going to use a little bit of black acrylic paint and do a couple coats on here. You may have to use a smaller brush to get into all the creases. And once it was dry, I sprayed it with 2 coats of Aleene's acrylic sealer. And that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.